Hi there, I am Elizabeth Barrett, and I was invited by Algoma Family Services to speak this evening, and I'm very privileged to do so. I would like to talk about how you can cope with your child's challenging behaviors, and right now we're in such uncertain times. I think this is a good time to be talking about challenging behaviors. I just wanted to, first of all, explain a little bit about myself. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and what that means is I'm a medical doctor. I've completed training in both adult and child psychiatry, so I did extra training in child and adolescent psychiatry. And so I have worked for about 10 years in Sault Ste. Marie as a child psychiatrist, and retired from my practice at Group Health Center. I'm now just doing some consulting work. And just so people know the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a social worker and a therapist, a psychiatrist is someone who can make a diagnosis and prescribe medication. A psychologist can also make a diagnosis, and in fact, they're very good at doing so. They do a lot of tests, and the difference is that they can't prescribe medication. Psychiatrists and psychologists can both do therapy, as can therapists and social workers. We have Algoma Family Services has a lot of wonderful people working, mental health workers, and we all kind of work as a team to support the mental health of children and youth and their families. When I'm going through the slides, occasionally you'll see a small number in a bracket, and that corresponds rather to some references I have at the end of my presentation on the second to last slide. Other thing I just wanted to mention is the reason when we sent out this email, this was directed for something to help caregivers. The reason I use caregivers instead of parent is because parent kind of excludes a lot of people who do care for children and youth. So I think the term caregiver is a little more inclusive. With regard to gender terms, I have used he and she and sometimes them, just sometimes for clarity's sake, I'll use one gender, and that's not to really to simplify it, but I do recognize that youth and caregivers may choose themselves to identify with different types of gender terms, but I'm just wanted to get that out there. I chose to talk about this topic because right now with COVID-19, we have been obviously things have changed a lot for people in people's lives, and parents are seeing more challenging behaviors. And that's not a surprise to anybody. There was a survey done in Ontario, April 29th and 30th, and at that time, when we were still sort of on lockdown, 45% of adults reported that they had noticed a deterioration in their mental health. In that same survey, 59% of people who were parents had noted behavior changes in their children since the start of the social distancing, and particularly with sleep, eating, irritability, outbursts, decreased concentration, and as it was termed in the survey, drastic changes in mood, behavior, or personality. Also, in that survey, 50% of parents noted that their children were spending more time online, on TV, and playing video games. So as we all know, that can certainly be the cause of a lot of challenging behaviors when we're trying to limit that screen time. And of note, also in that survey, 22% of parents noticed increased tension in their household. So I just wanted to put that out there first, because I think you don't really need to see these numbers to understand how stressful it is right now. And we're still under stress because there's so many questions and so much uncertainty. So with children and adults too, when we're feeling stressed, we can see more behaviors. So this talk isn't exactly specific to COVID-19, but I think that it will address some of the idea of challenging behaviors, which whatever's the cause of it, there are all sorts of challenging behaviors, and I just want us to understand them. in a way that's a little different than what we normally look at with behaviors. So normally we just consider motivation when we're thinking about challenging behaviors, and I'll talk a little bit more about motivation in a moment. But I wanted to talk about some other factors that contribute to challenging behaviors besides motivation. So those include brain differences, activation of the part of the brain that's called the amygdala, and that's where I'm calling it the danger detection system, but that's officially called the amygdala. 3, there are often modifiable and environmental conditions that we can sort of adjust. And 4thly, as a caregiver, your perception of your child and their behavior and your expectations for them can influence how challenging behaviors can persist and how we can help them. And the reason for looking at all of this is that a lot of times we're just addressing motivation when we're talking about dealing with challenging behaviors. And I wanted to show that there's other areas we can kind of intervene other than just trying to increase motivation. So that's the point of me talking about these different things. And a lot of this is relevant right now because of the stress that we're under with COVID. So I'm not going to be able to give you a whole bunch of answers for the challenging behaviors tonight because I've only got an hour. But really what I wanted to achieve was to have you have a shift in your perspective, changing the lens we use when we're looking at challenging behaviors to see them in a different light. And I'm kind of going to show a little bit more of a brain-based and emotion-focused collaborative approach as opposed to just straight traditional behavior management. I'm going to just talk about that a little bit. And I'd like you also to understand that you have so much expertise as caregivers, and you already know how to read your child and read the environment when there's challenging behaviors. So a lot of this stuff is stuff that you already know, but hopefully there might be a couple of things you might pick up that might add a tool to your caregiving toolbox. And also some of the things I'm going to talk about might help to build closer connections with your child. So what's different? Again, I talked about motivation, and a lot of what we use to motivate behavior is rewards and punishments. And that if we're only just looking at motivation, we're not really always being compassionate in our understanding of our child or ourselves, or even considering the unique qualities of your child and yourself. And sometimes we put labels and diagnoses on people and think, well, that's just what they've got. But sometimes we can look at what parts of those labels and diagnoses are skills that maybe the child's brain hasn't developed yet, and maybe there's ways we can help them to develop those skills. And a lot of this comes from the work of Dr. Ross Green, and I've included him on my reference list. And he has an excellent book called The Explosive Child, but he does a lot of work with this sort of, these kind of challenging behaviors, and he has a lot of awesome things to say. So I've included his name and website and some books he's written at the end. So really what I'm talking about is trying to discover who your child is now, not who you wish them to be or how others think they should be. And that's just kind of a little thought to put in your head. So why have I called it challenging behaviors? Well, I think that that might be the more politically correct way of saying difficult to manage behaviors. But I think the word challenge is appropriate because a lot of these behaviors that we're talking about are things that challenge our position as an authority figure. They challenge our parenting skills and our frustration level. They challenge our ability to stay calm and flexible when we're responding to our child. They challenge our feelings of competency as a caregiver and our perceptions of ourselves and our child. And they challenge the emotional climate in our homes and the perceptions and reactions of other people like extended family, teachers, principals, and peers. So that's where the word challenging comes from. So I don't know if I don't really need to give you a big long list of challenging behaviors. I think a lot of that you quite understand what I'm talking about. It's when children are, oppositional, refusing to do what you'd like them to do, having meltdowns, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of important still to think about the basics. If I'm using, I kind of let you know what challenging means, but what is actually a behavior? What is a behavior? And a behavior is something, an action that we can observe our child doing. But it's not just that. It's also a form of communication. Often it's a way that a child will be expressing a need or an emotion because they don't have the words for it. And a lot of what we see with challenging behaviors is a response to a request from a caregiver or an adult. We ask our child to do something, and then they perhaps don't respond, or respond in a way that we don't really want them to. But basically what we're doing, what a child's doing is sort of allowing what's inside of them show outside. And of course, children aren't born with language skills, and they have to develop language skills. And for a long time in their, in infancy, they can only communicate via behavior, but those skills of communicating what's going on inside them gradually develop and improve. But even through adolescence, there can be some struggles with putting these kinds of things into words. So we do see behaviors instead of words. And in fact, some adults persist with using behavior instead of words. But what happens, again, you as caregivers have a lot of expertise because you are used to reading your child's, I've called it behavior language. So it's the behaviors that we see. Often we know very well what these mean, especially when kids are little, we know when they're hungry by their cry and all of those things. So caregivers, this is a skill that you're probably very adept at. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about how behaviors communicate. So again, specifically to challenging behaviors. So an example of behavior language, you ask your daughter to go to bed. She slumps down on the couch, crosses her arms, and says no. So she's communicating to us clearly that she does not want to go to bed right now. Why is she doing this? Well, I think sometimes when we're not on our best, in our best state of mind, and we're exhausted at the end of the day, we might like to think sometimes that she likes to be difficult and she just wants to be difficult, or she always wants to get her own way. And that's often the sort of thoughts that pop into our head, especially if we are used to seeing these kind of challenging behaviors over and over again. But I think it's not a surprise for all of you to know that obviously there might be some other need or emotion she could be communicating. Perhaps she's having fun. She said she's thinking inside her head, I'm having fun and I don't want to stop. I don't want to miss out on anything. Everyone else gets to stay up. I'm afraid of the dark. And appropriate to right now, perhaps the child's thinking, I want to spend more time with you because you seem stressed and I'm scared that something will happen to you while I'm away from you in bed overnight. And I hear that from kids who are anxious. And so, kids notice when you're stressed, and that can create problems with wanting to go to bed. So going back to that behavior that we saw her slumping, on the sofa and crossing her arms and saying no, that, part of the behavior was a verbal response, but the rest of it's body language. But, we can often interpret that with regard to motivation. I don't want to do that. And, the kind of thoughts how we interpret that as well. She obviously hasn't learned her lesson yet, so we better amp up the rewards and punishments. I haven't been tough enough on her. She's not trying hard enough. We also often get caught up in the idea of respect, and that, the little one saying, in your mind, you're thinking she's doesn't respect you, doesn't know who's the boss. She might use words like, you can't make me do that. You might think she's just always wanting to get her own way. She knows how to push my buttons. Kids these days are spoiled. These are all things that we often think about when we see these kinds of challenging behaviors. So motivation theory suggests that a child does not obey because they don't want to, or they're not trying hard enough. And adults, for most of us, we've been taught that targeting motivation is the best way to help your child to behave. And you know what? It does work. For many kids, just targeting motivation may work very well, but there are some, of course, I see the children, and lots of people at Algoma Family Services see these children that are having more to struggle, and it's not just motivation. So again, motivation, personal motivation, is the reason that you want to act in a particular way, or it's a desire or willingness to act, or enthusiasm for a particular action. So here's the thing, though. Kids need to feel confident in their ability to do what you're asking them to do in order to feel motivated. So that can sometimes be a problem. So confidence goes with motivation. And when you use motivational techniques, it can help kids to start a behavior, maintain a behavior, or work towards a goal. I mean, we use motivational techniques to go on diets and exercise programs and stuff. So there's nothing wrong with motivational techniques. But I want us to look, I'm going to look at some brain functions now to just get a better idea of how there are more functions than motivation that contribute to some of these challenging behaviors. So let's go back to the fact that you've requested your child to go to bed, and you get that response that we talked about. So what I want you to understand is that there's a lot of steps that go between the request and the behavior that comes out at the end. The other thing we also need to think about is that we often, have this idea that we know better because we're adults, and in fact, that we do have more experience, and that can be the truth. But we also sometimes expect kids to think the same way that we do, and I think we need to always keep in the back of our mind that a kid's brain isn't the same as an adult brain. They're less logical, less future-oriented. They have more difficulty delaying gratification. They have more difficulty with problem solving and organizing responses because their brain's is developing, and they haven't developed all those skills yet. So those kind of skills I just talked about, we sometimes call it executive function, because it's like the part of your brain that does that is like the executive, and it organizes all those activities. Now that executive function occurs in the part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is up in the front. And that part of the brain does not get fully developed until about age 25. So I think sometimes when we run into problems with kids, it's because we're expecting them to understand things in the same way. Like, if I don't go to bed right now, I'm going to be cranky tomorrow. Well, as adults, we kind of get that, but it's harder for the child's brain to grasp that idea. And I also going to show you this very complicated slide, but what I want to show here is that there's a lot of steps that go between when you request something of your child and when you get the response, the behavior response. So there's a number of different steps that we need to go through. And this is me kind of generalizing the steps. Like, this isn't entirely every single step, but I tried to put it into little categories to make it simpler. And I've kind of put it in this, I've called it the behavior ladder, just because you kind of go up the steps, and then at the top you get to execute the response that is being requested of you. So it's a little complicated, but it's okay that it's complicated, because I just want you to notice that there are, number 7 is motivation, but there's 8 steps there. So it's not just motivation that's involved in answering or responding to your request. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each step. And again, you don't need to understand the full details about each step, but it's just that idea that motivation is only one step. So other thing you need to understand is all of these things are going on automatically in the child's brain within a split second, and it's outside of consciousness. So the child is unaware of this process going on. Also, malfunctions can occur in any one of those different steps, or more than one of those steps. And the product of this, this process, it's not deliberate, it's not a planned, deliberate thing. All of this occurs outside of consciousness. And we also need to understand that we go through the same process when we're responding to what our child shows us. So if we ask them to do something, they show us a behavior, well, we're going to respond to that behavior through the same processes. So what I'm going to talk about is that I'm going to say the ability to climb that behavior ladder is affected by people having brains that maybe are a little different, don't operate quite the same as the average person. And those differences can either come with, I've said they can either be without a label, which just means they're descriptions of behaviors and the ways of a child is. And sometimes the child's had a mental health diagnosis. So that's a label we can put onto the way that brain works. So again, these next few slides are a little complicated, but you don't really need to understand everything that I've written on it, just the whole idea. So we're going to go to that first step in that whole ladder is, in order to receive a request from somebody and process it and put out a response, in fact, our nervous system has to be calm in the first place. When we're calm, we're open to receive information and our brain skills are ready to operate. But when we're not calm, that can really put a damper on all of this. Furthermore, there are a lot of things I've written down on one side, brain differences. So there's a lot of things, like a person could be very sensitive to things in the environment. They could have been maybe traumatized, and so they're always looking out for danger. They might just be a kind of a hyper high-strung person. So they might, in general, not be calm. So anytime you're going to make a request for them, you have to think about that. And of course, there's different diagnoses. And again, I'm not going to go through every one of these, but if a person has anxiety, or if a person has a learning disability and you're asking them to do something in the school setting, and it has to do with school. So what I'm just trying to show here is that there are a lot of things that can affect you having a calm nervous system. And that's the first thing that you need to have in order to go to the next step, which is attention. So in order to pay attention to something, you have to be able to filter out whatever distractions are in the environment. You have to be able to shift gears from the activity you're in now to, oh, okay, my mom's asked me to do something. And you have to focus on your mother. So again, there are many conditions or many differences in brains that can make it difficult to do that. The third step is you have to register, hey, someone's sending me some information. And that information comes from the words that you use, but also the tone of voice you're using, your body language. So, and then the brain has to receive that information. And there's a little component too, that the brain has to trust that this is a reliable piece of information coming in. And then it has to transfer it from the receiving to the parts of the brain that do the rest of the process of coming out with making a response. So in order to once it's in the brain, you have to be able to comprehend what information is being sent in that request. And that's both the verbal and the nonverbal. So some, kids, if you have a problem with language, you have trouble with understanding language. If you've got, if you're on the autism spectrum, you have trouble reading nonverbal body language. So you can see where that can start to cause this step to go awry. You have to interpret the information, and a lot of how we interpret things is filtered by our own attitudes. And in cognitive behavior therapy, we sort of got this idea that we've got automatic thoughts and core beliefs, that beliefs about ourselves and the world around us and the people around us. So if you've got sort of a negative belief about the world, you're going to sort of interpret through the filter of negativity. Or if you're always anxious, you're going to interpret through the filter of fear. So again, we don't need to know all the details, but I want you to understand that those things affect how you understand the mother's request to go to bed. And then the next step is processing and interpreting. And the way things are processed is you often, oh, okay, this is, I'm getting this message now, and I have to compare it to situations in the past where I've got that message, and how did it all turn out. And we also have this part that it kind of labels stuff as good or bad. And so if something's sort of labeled as good, you're going to be drawn to listen to it or go in the direction it's asking you to go. If you interpret it, this part of your brain says, no, we don't, we're rejecting that. That can really put things awry. And then we have to be able to have the ability to think through process that what's been requested of us. And it's interesting, kids who have learning disabilities, particularly a reading learning disability, they can have problems with thinking through and processing, because that is kind of a language-based behavior, or it's a language-based brain skill that you have to understand language to think things through. So that's why sometimes kids with learning disabilities, it's not just that they can't read, but it can also make it hard for them to process things in general if you make a request to them. Now, the next part, this is the stuff that goes on in the prefrontal cortex, that executive function I talked about. So, you know, when you make a plan, you have to say, okay, well, this is one thing I can do. This is one option, and I could do it this other way. And how am I gonna respond to this request? And that also requires that you have what we call impulse control, which means you can stay on task. You can stick with doing the planning. And you also have to have some flexibility, because otherwise you might end up coming up with the same plan every time. And, you know, sometimes we see that with kids with autism, they tend to be sort of inflexible in coming up with other ways of doing things. And then now motivation. So we talked about motivation. You have to feel capable to do what you're being asked to do. You have to understand the consequences. If I do it or don't do it, I have to be willing to act, and I have to be able to delay gratification, because maybe I was doing something fun and I don't want to go to bed. And then the last step is being able to initiate the task that you're being asked to do, because some people have problems in their brain that makes it hard to start behaviors. And sometimes that can look like procrastination. Sometimes anxiety does that, but you also have to be able to follow through on the response. You have to be capable of responding verbally or capable of doing the behavior you're being asked to do. And that also involves some impulse control so you can stay on task. So you can see how complicated this is. So that's where I'm just talking about how brain skills are required to respond to a request. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call the danger detection system. That's the part of the brain called the amygdala, and that's the part we're born with, and it's there to keep us safe and alive. It's to detect life-threatening danger in our environment. And when we detect danger, it's very unconscious. This happens in a split second. This happens before we even know that thing is in front of us. It's like the part of our brain sees like a bear in front of us, and it goes on red alert, and automatically it signals the brain to go into fight or flight, which is to stay and fight the enemy or the danger or run away. Sometimes we freeze, and that's not necessarily always the best thing to do in a dangerous situation, but that can be a common response that people have when their amygdala gets stimulated. And when that part of your brain is stimulated, it overrides the part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex that thinks and reasons, like the executive function. So in that moment, you can't think properly. And of course, you can't learn properly if you can't think properly. So this is when you're trying to teach someone a lesson and they're in this kind of state of red alert, it's not going to work very well. And also, when someone goes into this state, it's not on purpose or planned. So, you know, if we have that part of our brain, because back when we were cavemen, we needed to know when something was dangerous and how to deal with it. But it comes out in different ways in behavior. And now that we don't live in such a dangerous place, we can have that response triggered for many other reasons. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But how does it look when a child is in the fight response? Well, they can argue, get on the defensive, swear, blame, say hateful things, get physical. And in the flight response, they can run out of the room, avoid, make excuses not to do something, which isn't really flight, but it's sort of a mental flight. They can lie as a way of getting out of doing what they are being asked to do. When someone goes into the freeze response, they avoid, shut down, refuse to act. So you can see how a fight, flight, or freeze response can look very much like a challenging behavior. So there's some cases where, because of brain differences, the brain is kind of, I'm going to call it being on constant red alert. And the danger detection system is on red alert even when there actually is no life-threatening danger in front of us. And when that's happening, remember, we go back to that behavior ladder. If the nervous system isn't calm, it can't be calm when you're on red alert. So you can't really start climbing the behavior ladder to respond to a request. So those kind of brains and those kind of, differences in brains, that's a tough one for them. And the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is false alarms. So let me explain what I mean. I call it attachment false alarms. So when we are born, we are helpless and unable to take care of ourselves. So we, mammals, species we belong to, require an attachment to an adult who can keep them safe and respond to their needs. Because when you're an infant, you can't feed yourself or change your diaper. You need an adult to take care of you. And in fact, you need an adult to take care of you for a lot longer than infancy. And this attachment bond that we form with an adult creates a bond of love. And we all know that, when you have a baby, you quickly, that bond is such a strong feeling of love. And in that way, in our brains, the feelings of safety get tied up with the feelings of being loved. So even this sort of starts in infancy and persists. So that idea that safety and love are kind of equated with each other. So a child feels safe when they know that they are consistently and unconditionally loved, even if they make a mistake or upset their caregiver. So a fear of displeasing your caregiver or getting in trouble can be misinterpreted in the danger detection system as a threat to losing a caregiver's love. And of course, that would mean you were unsafe. If you don't have a caregiver around to look after you, you're unsafe. So that would set off what we're going to call a false alarm. The brain's saying, hey, something really dangerous is going on, and it's not something dangerous. And so it can trigger an unwarranted fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And if the child's afraid they're going to get in trouble for something, they might get terrified. It looks like they're terrified, and all it is they're afraid of getting in trouble, afraid of being, they're making their parent unhappy. So you can't really start climbing that behavior ladder if you're in a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And so again, we can have a challenging behavior. So another area that again contributes to challenging behaviors is conditions that are things that you can modify or things about the environment. And this is where caregivers are experts. For instance, if your child's cold or hot or hungry or needs to go to the bathroom, they're off schedule, tired, they're too stimulated or not stimulated enough, if they're doing something fun or not fun, you transition too quickly. All these things sort of, we know that when we're setting a kid up for trouble, maybe when you're asking a kid to do something when, they love video games and they've been on the video game for half an hour, maybe you got to transition them to a less fun activity before you get them to go to bed. So it's just that whole idea, these are things caregivers are really excellent at. And the last thing though, the number 4 are how caregivers' perceptions shape our responses to our child. And not just our responses, but how we process it in our heads. So we interpret our child's challenging behaviors through our own filter. And that's influenced by the way we have our, what we call core beliefs, the way we think about ourselves, our world, and our children as well. So I'll give you an example. So say, your daughter is refusing to go to bed, and you might feel kind of negative about it. So some of the thoughts we have pop in our head are, what's wrong with my child? Why does she always push my buttons? Why can't she behave? Why can't she respect me? Also thoughts about yourself. People will think I'm a bad parent. Maybe I am a bad parent. Or when I was a kid, I respected my elder. Why does this always happen when I'm having a bad day? So those kind of perceptions can affect how we respond with our child, and that can feed into the challenging behavior, make it get worse, not go away. So how we label our child's behavior affects our own emotions, the words we're going to use with them, our tone of voice, our body language, what we do, how our child's going to read us, because we have parts of our brain that we can read our children very well. They can read us. They're called mirror neurons. So, and that in turn will affect how they respond to us. And this is how these sort of interactions of challenging behavior can get set up. And there are certain labels that are what I call shaming. So these would be things, if you in your head are thinking, you know, this child is being disrespectful, attention seeking, overly sensitive, manipulative, controlling, stubborn, those kinds of words. As soon as you have those labels pop up in your head, it's going to have an effect. So I want to talk just a little bit about that word shame, because it's something you kind of have to, sometimes we all kind of know what it is, but there's a lot of work by Brené Brown. Some of you may have heard of her. She has an excellent TED Talk and all kinds of stuff on the internet, but she talks a lot about shame, and this is where I've kind of learned about this idea. But I think we need to just differentiate between guilt, embarrassment, and shame. So guilt is when you regret something that you did, and oftentimes because it went against your morals or values. And then embarrassment is worry about being judged for something you did. So those are both about something you did. The difference with shame is that it's a feeling that you are defective and unlovable. And that kind of feeling can immobilize you, which means you can't really move or do anything. It can also be quite contagious. So if you are feeling shame, you could pass shame on to people around you. And I think a lot of what this Brené Brown talks about is shifting away from shame, because shame demolishes our self-esteem and our self-confidence, and it can trigger the danger detection system that I talked about earlier. And so if we shift our perspective, our words, and our body language away from shaming our child and ourselves, we can free ourselves and our child to act without shame. So it's just something we need to keep in mind. The other thing is oftentimes caregivers can feel shamed for their own caregiving skills, too permissive, too harsh, inconsistent. And comparing ourselves to other caregivers or receiving unwanted opinions can certainly cause us to feel ashamed of ourselves. And so it's important to practice self-compassion and know that you're doing the best you can in this moment. We all have our moments when we maybe, you know, things aren't going as well as we'd like them to, but self-shame is very immobilizing. The other thing to talk about is that all of us, as we're growing up, we develop something called mental models. It's sort of our idea of the way the things around us should be, the way we should be. So a lot of times as parents or caregivers, your wishes and dreams and fantasies about your child will shape your mental model of what's an ideal child, and what's an ideal parent, and what's an ideal parent-child relationship. And it's influenced, of course, by our upbringing, experiences, society, all kinds of things. But it's really this sort of unconscious part in our brain of who we wish our child, you know, how we wish our child would act, who we think they should be. Sometimes tied in with that is who others think they should be. So it's this sort of idea of shoulds, where a child should be or what we should be versus what we can do or can be. So it's a, you know, expectations can really play into that whole dynamic between child and parent and I should say caregiver. So let's go back to this talk about challenging behaviors. So a lot of times when we use the motivation theory, we're saying the child won't do it. What if your child can't do what you're asking to do? And that's why you're seeing the challenging behavior. So what if for some reason the child lacks the required brain skills because they haven't yet developed or they have a condition that causes a brain difference? What if you've had so many negative interactions in the past that this particular interaction is activating the danger detection system, and there's a false alarm, or the brain's always on red alert because everything's so negative around the house? What if there's certain conditions or something in the environment making it difficult to access the required skills in this moment? And what if, as a caregiver, your perceptions and expectations affect the words you're using or your body language? They might maybe convey shame or negative thoughts to the child, and that could set off that false alarm and the danger detection system. could make the child feel that they're not capable of doing the behavior. So it may be at this moment in time that maybe your child is unable to produce the requested response. And that's why you're getting that sort of not requested response, which is slumping on the couch and folding her arms and saying no. So again, we'll go back to the idea of motivation. So, when we use a reward, it's to increase the likelihood of an expected or desired behavior, because the person who's being rewarded expects that something pleasant is going to happen. So if I do what's asked of me, I will get something good. Punishments lessen the likelihood of an undesirable behavior because something unpleasant will happen. So if I do this, there'll be a negative consequence and I'll pay for it. So those are the kind of things that we use a lot of times with these behaviors, and that's fine. We do need to remember, though, that if you're trying to motivate somebody, they need to be capable of the behavior you're trying to motivate. They need to be confident in their skills to do it. Because punishments and rewards will only work if the child already possesses the skills required to process and respond to your request, and just needs to be motivated to use those skills. So if you don't have the skills to do the brain skills to go down that, up that behavior ladder, you may not be able to even process that request, let alone produce the response that's needed. So you can motivate that all you want, but the child can't do it. And oftentimes, I call this invisible motivation. A lot of times, kids may actually be motivated, but they're just not showing it. And, Dr. Ross Green talks about this, that most kids already know that you are the boss. They don't need to be reminded of that. And they do want to please you because they have an attachment bond with you. And deep down, most kids have good intentions. They don't wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to be difficult today, or hey, I'm going to refuse to go to bed tonight. These things happen in the moment, and they're not necessarily planned or deliberate. So when a child refuses your request, I'm asking you to think about this. Maybe you could change the lens that you're looking at it and use curiosity, not judgment, just get curious about the situation and start with the assumption your child has good intentions and think about it. Okay, I've asked my child to do this. Well, what are the skills required to perform this particular behavior? And put yourself in their shoes and think, what could my child possibly be feeling right now? And actually, because we have these things called mirror neurons in our brain, we can actually reflect. It actually helps us to be quite connected to our kids. And oftentimes, you can kind of feel inside yourself what your child's feeling. So if you're in a situation and you are with somebody and they're angry, oftentimes you feel angry inside yourself too. Or if someone's sad, you feel sad too, especially your child. So you can use your own feelings to kind of gauge, maybe that's what my child's feeling too, or maybe they're feeling something else. You're probably an expert at reading your kids. And also try to think, what are they trying to communicate to me in this moment with this particular behavior? And you also need to kind of take a moment to look inside yourself. What are your own perceptions, expectations, and feelings in this moment? And generate sort of hypotheses. What could be making it hard for her to perform this behavior right now? So I'm going back to the girl that you asked to go to bed. So again, I understand that you can't always do these steps in the moment, but if you change your perspective and start to think about this, it can actually help you to see things in a slightly different light when you get into these situations. But of course, again, I'm saying it's difficult in the moment to do these things, but if we know that there's certain specific situations that result in challenging behaviors, maybe you can sit down and think about it. And in fact, we call this sort of being proactive instead of dealing with things in the moment. And Dr. Ross Green has a lot of excellent stuff on his websites and his books that help you to think about this and help you to plan this. So an idea, if you wanted to do sort of a mini version of this, is sort of identify some challenging behaviors, but rate them in order of your child's current abilities to to control those behaviors, and tackle the easiest one first. Because if you're gonna, don't start with the hardest one, but just sit down and think about what are those elements that we've talked about could be affecting your child, and where can you make changes. The other thing to understand that when you're in these situations, a lot of times we want to jump in and provide practical support for a child, and our words aren't always going to be taken in. Remember, if our nervous system is not calm, we can't go through all the processing. So there's work, it's called emotion-focused family therapy, but there's also an excellent book I've recommended at the end using the principles of emotion-focused family therapy, but they talk about you have to help to soothe their emotions first, to help calm them so they can start to climb that behavior ladder. Then you can use words and provide practical support. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but I just want to plant that seed in your head. So let's just look at an idea of, making a proactive plan for a challenging behavior. So let's say we figured out, well, this child does have a difference in their brain. There's a difference in the way their brain processes or goes through those different steps I spoke about. Now, sometimes if a child, we know that they have a deficit, there's something in their brain that's always going to be there or is going to take a while to develop, we sometimes have to accommodate that. And that's where we do things like, if you have a kid, they're inflexible, they don't transition well, then you're going to give them warnings, 5-minute warnings. So that's where we're kind of accommodating these brain differences and finding ways to help our child develop lagging skills in a lot of these brain activities. At the same time, we need to boost self-confidence, because if a child doesn't feel confident, they're not going to be motivated to try to learn these new skills or that you want to teach them. And the other thing is, let's go back to that danger detection system. If that's in operation all the time, well, the child's not going to be able to process your requests. So think about ways to keep the environment as much as you can calm. And again, we can't always do that, but even in those moments we often hear this, to calm ourselves, to help us, and that can help us to calm our child. And the other thing about that is maybe avoid fights that aren't worth it. So if it's a fight to do everything, then what's going to happen is you're going to be in that chronic, constant red alert place in your family. So it's important to maybe look at how many fights that we're having. And also, you often hear, find some time to have good, positive one-on-one time with your child so we can break up a lot of that negative stuff. Again, adjust where you can in the environment. Again, this is something most of you are very good at. And again, that idea of checking your own perceptions to make sure that your perceptions about the situation are accurate, and are your expectations reasonable? Before you make a plan for how you want to tackle a behavior, or even in the moment before you speak or act. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is Dr. Grosgreen's Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. But a couple of the things, he talks about that kids need help with frustration tolerance and flexibility, kids who have these challenging behaviors. He talks about choosing your battles. And he talks about sort of looking at behaviors and putting them into three sort of, and his older books was talking about baskets, but now he talks about plan A, B, C. So there's some behaviors that you need to tackle, and you can't have to do straight up traditional behavioral stuff with those because there's safety concern. Like, there's no choice, you got to do this, I'm the boss, I'm the authority, you're going to do this. There's also some situations you might want to put off till later. Maybe let's work on helping the kid to develop some other of their brain skills, and we'll put that off for now. So that's choosing your battles. And then there are some places, he calls that plan B, where you're going to help the child to develop the skills that they're lacking to be able to go through all those steps. For instance, when you make a request for them to do something. So again, let's go back to in the moment. You've asked your child to do something, you're seeing a challenging behavior. Think to yourself, what task am I expecting my child to do? Now, it seems like the child can't do this in this moment. Is that something that they always can't do, or is it just in this particular moment? And what might be getting in the way of them doing it? And is there something I can do right now to adjust the situation? So again, in the moment, these are some thoughts to have where things are getting stuck. Is there a difference about your child's brain that makes them capable of doing this task in general, or do they need to develop some more skills to get to the ability to to do what's requested of them? And do they have confidence in their ability to use their skills? Again, think about the danger detection system and calming people, modifying and making adjustments where you can. And again, think inside your head about your perceptions and expectations. What labels am I using right now? Are my expectations reasonable? Can I adjust my expectations? So again, if our goal, what is our goal in the situation? Are we trying to, that idea, let's teach a lesson once and for all, or I need to set an example with this because her siblings are watching, or this is inconvenient for me now, so I've just got to nip this in the bud. So again, if you keep using the same rewards and punishments and they're not working, maybe you got to think about another approach. Not to take them all away, but look at these other things to think about as well. So there's this, I put him in my references, his name is Dr. Jerome Schultz, and he deals with ADHD and learning disabilities a lot, but he talks about how a lot of times when kids get super stressed, it's because they feel like they can't do what's being asked of them. And we've got to give kids some successes. So if we're trying to get them to change a behavior, you might have to modify tasks that you're requesting of them to make it a little bit easier to start with so they get some initial success and then gradually increase the difficulty. And he also talks about, like, a lot of times we are only rewarding the child if they get everything perfectly right. So we want them to, okay, I'm going to ask you to go to bed and I want you to get up at this moment, go brush your teeth, get your clothes on, get yourself in bed. You want the perfectly formed behavior. But what about if we reward the child for trying to move towards that instead of just yelling at them for not having the finished product? Lack of success makes the nervous system less calm. It decreases the ability to use your brain skills, and it erodes self-confidence in yourself and your child. And Jerome Schultz talked about this study that they did, and if you've had one failure at doing something, you need to follow that up with 3 successes in order to feel competent and confident enough to keep trying. So imagine these poor kids who are struggling, never getting anything right. They're going to give up trying. Again, what I'm talking about here, I don't have a one-size-fits-all here for you, but I want you to think, just think about some of the things I've said, but I also, it takes time to make lasting changes. And with practice, if children and caregivers experience success, that'll increase confidence and increase motivation and increase the likelihood that both your child and yourself will use new skills in the future. And this is something, when a child's having challenging behaviors, this is something that you have to work with them. It's a together thing. And by working together, it will enhance your connection with your child. And you already know their behavior language. Most of you are well versed in it. Remember that how you're feeling in this moment may reflect how your child's feeling, and how you're feeling may reflect how your child may also read you. And you can use that, your own feelings, sometimes think, well, I wonder what my child's feeling right now. Maybe the message they're trying to get to me is not that they're angry. Maybe it's that they're afraid. So initially, when children have challenging behaviors, you might need to be their emotion regulator. So you need to regulate that amygdala, that danger detection system. And you might need to be their behavior organizer, their prefrontal cortex, until they develop the skills that they need to over time. And I just wanted to have a quick word about mental health diagnoses. So if your child has a diagnosis, it's important to learn not just the name, but how it affects those brain skills required, for instance, to respond to a request with the appropriate behavior. Going back to that slide I showed you, how different conditions can affect each of those brain steps. Also, certain diagnoses tend to activate that danger detection system, maybe put it into chronic red alert or make it more susceptible to false alarms. And also, if there's a diagnosis, find out how environmental factors can affect the diagnosis, like being in a noisy environment, or expecting your child to go shopping with you to the mall, or certain conditions, like if a child has sensory sensitivities, maybe those are things that are going to be really difficult for the child. And also I want you to think about how your own perceptions and expectations are affected by the label the child's been given. And sometimes we can have unconscious thoughts inside our head about things like perhaps we think we don't really understand. Maybe we think that depression, if someone has depression, it just means they're negative and they're not trying hard enough. But sometimes our perceptions about the labels that have been put on your child can affect how we behave with our child. So we're going to go back to your child. Most children absolutely know you're the boss, and they want you to love them, and they want to please you, and they want to do well. They have good intentions, but unconscious processes get in the way. And your children read your perceptions by the way that your body, your tone of voice, your body language, your words, and this affects their own perceptions about themselves and their ability to do what they are asked to do. To develop new skills to move through these challenging behaviors, they need to see your confidence that they can learn and grow and find new ways to respond. So my hope is that after listening to me talk, you'll walk away with the possibility of maybe just considering a different perspective about your child when it comes to challenging behaviors. And I think this is particularly important right now, when we are so overwhelmed with what's going on and so tired. Sometimes it's important to sort of put on a new set of lenses and look at this in a different way. And you might think, well, what's that going to do if I change my perspective about the behavior? Well, we know that small changes in perspective can result in small shifts in behavior on your part and on your child's part. And over time, if you have patience and you practice and you have self-compassion and don't shame yourself, if you're willing to learn from mistakes as you go, these things can change. So I'm hoping that I've been able to present things to you that maybe make you think about things in a different way. And this slide talks about the survey I mentioned at the beginning, but also Brene Brown, Ross Green, Adele LaFrance, and Ashley Miller have this new book called What to Say to Your Kids When Nothing Seems to Work, which is really has some awesome emotion-focused strategies. Jerome Schultz he deals a lot with kids with ADHD and learning disabilities. And a lot of the stuff about the brain I've learned through Dr. Daniel Siegel's work. He's a Siegel, not Siegel. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist who I took one of his attachment courses, but he's really good at understanding the way the brain works and how if the brain is tied in with attachment relationships. And he's written a couple of amazing books that I mentioned there.